I hereby call this meeting of Norwood City Council to order. Please rise for a prayer and pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in these council chambers. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we may do all things well, according to thy will. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Williams, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Basil.
Here.
Mr. DeRacy.
Here.
Mrs. Lake.
Here.
Mr. Kelch.
Here.
Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Brady.
Here.
All members present. Moving on to item E, amendment of agenda.
Thank you.
We have an ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declare an emergency to add to the agenda. The Exhibit A is attached to the back, and we will make that item L2. Mr. DiNardo.
Make a motion to accept this amendment.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to accept the change. Mrs. Lake.
Second?
Second by Ms. Lake. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Basil.
Yes.
Mr. DeRacy.
Yes.
Mrs. Lake.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Brady.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to minutes of previous meeting, October 12th, 2021 minutes and October 26th, 2021 minutes. Mr. Thompson.
Move we receive and file the minutes.
Motion to receive and file the minutes by Mr. Thompson. May I have a second? Mr. Brady.
Second.
Second by Mr. Brady. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Basil.
Yes.
Mr. DeRacy.
Yes.
Mrs. Lake.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Brady.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. We do not have any requests to address council this evening, so we'll move on to item I, reports of standing committees of council, housing, health, and public spaces, November 1st, 2021 meeting. Mr. DeRacy.
It's a slightly longer one, so I'm going to have to defer it to the next meeting to make sure I get everything on there.
Thank you, sir. Moving on to item L. L1, introductory reading of ordinances and resolutions. L1, ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to sell surplus specialized dispatch communications equipment by entering into an equipment purchase agreement with the Hamilton County Commission and declaring an emergency. Ms. Lake.
Chief McCabe is here, and I wonder if he could come up and discuss this, let us know how critical this is.
Thank you.
Good evening. This is actually pretty critical to get done. The commission obviously had a meeting today. Prosecutor's office does all the contract work for anything from the commission side. They did this agreement. It was vetted by our legal team, looked at it. It's one of those things where it's the last part of the shuttering of our dispatch center. This is a way for taxpayers to reclaim some of the money that was invested in that system. This stuff is almost at end of use. A new dispatch center that would be built today would actually buy the next generation of the system. So us selling it, getting, which is essentially 1 year's dispatch fees out of it, is actually a win for our city. So I recommend having all three readings and getting it passed.
Can I ask a question through the chair? It says that, if I understood it, that the check was going to go to the company. Is this money that we still owe, or did I misread that?
No, the check should come directly to the general fund.
Okay.
This equipment was paid off in May of this year.
Okay, I misread it then.
We got the lease basically paid off early to have that done. So it's all free and clear.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chief. Anyone else? Thank you, Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee.
And I'd like to make a motion that we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Ms. Lake to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mr. Brady.
Second.
Second by Mr. Brady. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all three readings?
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to sell surplus specialized dispatch communications equipment by entering into an equipment purchase agreement with the Hamilton County Commission and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to sell surplus specialized dispatch communications equipment by entering into an equipment purchase agreement with the Hamilton County Commission and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to sell surplus specialized dispatch communications equipment by entering into an equipment purchase agreement with the Hamilton County Commission and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Ms. Lake.
I move that the ordinance be passed.
Motion by Ms. Lake to pass the ordinance. Mr. DeNardo.
A second, please.
Second by Mr. DeNardo. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, resolution passes. Moving on to item L2, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Mr. DeNardo.
I'd like to make a motion that all three readings are had.
Motion by Mr. DeNardo to have all three readings. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson?
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Mr. DeNardo.
Yeah, actually, I do have a question at the end of this. So a lot of these on the list here of varying decreases in appropriations related to funds, we heard from the auditor, Jim Stith, that the equal and opposite increases were made to other funds, and also that these are at the direction of the bond council. I didn't know about one of them, which says E911 wireless. And I was wondering, for $91,000, I was wondering if anybody had a comment or knew about that. But I do know that someone here might have more, but do you know? Yeah.
So that's the money that we received for the cell phones, cell phone companies that put in for the E911. So that'll be going away since we don't have our dispatch center.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Then that's it. The other ones are all fit in the original explanation.
Thanks, Mr. DeNardo. Mrs. Lake.
My understanding in talking to Mr. Stith too is that we're going to get a second ordinance next time to increase them, that he has to pass this first, take it down tomorrow, is my understanding, or Thursday to the Budget Commission meeting. And then once they approve it, then he'll be able to come back and redo what needs to be increased, depending on the amount of money that came in from the tip. So this is the first part, and we'll get the second part probably at the next meeting. But this needs to be done so we can take it down to the Budget Commission this week.
Thanks, Ms. Lake.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Anyone else? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all three readings?
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake.
Move the ordinance be passed.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to pass the ordinance. Mr. Braden. Second by Mr. Braden. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item M, administrative reports. Mayor Schneider is not here this evening, so we'll move on to item N, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business this evening? Mrs. Lake?
just kind of an update. The city we got a grant from Hamilton County Environmental Services to purchase compost bins, and we've Renee Durker has done 3 classes for us over the summer and given out most of the bins. There are like 3 or 4 left. So I just let you know that that's almost coming to a completion. We have to file a report with the county, probably the first of the year. But if there's anybody out there who wants the last 3 or so, we're not doing the classes anymore, but I have the handout that Mrs. Durker went over. She did a wonderful job of helping people be successful in composting, and so just to kind of give you an update on that. Thank you.
Excuse me. Any other unfinished business? No? Then we'll move on to, excuse me, move on to new business. Any new business? Mr. Kelch?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just before we go any further, I just wanted to make mention of the scouts of our Weeblo group of the Pac 99 of the Boy Scouts here in Norwood, and they're led here by Pac leader Sean and Jake, and they're learning about city government and government itself. So they decided it'd be a good opportunity to come watch one of our meetings, see how things are done, see what we do, and just check it out. So thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Excuse me. Any other new business? Then we move on to communications. Item P1, Mayor Victor Schneider, Mayor's Court fines.
Communication dated November 4th, 2021. Dear Mr. Ken Miracle, President and member of Norwood City Council. Dear Mr. President and council members, enclosed, please find the report for Norwood Mayor's Court for the month of October 2021. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that the letter be received and filed.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo, receive and file. You have a second, Mr. Narno?
Yes, please.
Any discussion? Please call roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Tracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, motion passes. Item P2, Mr. Tim Maloney, Treasurer, resignation letter.
Letter to Mr. Ken Miracle, President of Council, City of Norwood. Dear Mr. Miracle and council members, I write this letter to inform all citizens of my intention to retire and resign my position as Treasurer of the City of Norwood, effective end of day, November 30th, 2021. It has been my honor to serve since January 1st, 1998. I want to thank all of my fellow citizens for placing their trust and confidence in me for the last 24 years. Sincerely, Timothy Maloney, Treasurer, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Bond?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that the letter be received and filed.
Motion by Mr. Bonzel, may I have a second? Mr. Braden?
I'll second that.
Excuse me. Any discussion? Mr. Braden?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to note that Mr. Maloney has served his community for quite some time, and I personally want to thank him for his service, and I know him well, and I know him to be a good man, and I just want to make sure he realizes that we appreciate everything that he's done for this community, and I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden.
Thanks, John.
Ms. Lake?
I'd like to reiterate that. It's never easy to be in public service for that long and still come out with your mind intact. He's served through a couple of fiscal emergencies, I think, been through some really tough times and has really given us, estimates of our income. And he and Mr. Stith and have worked with council to keep us afloat when people expected that the lights were going to be turned out. So just want to express my appreciation to him for all of the work that he's done over the years. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson?
More the same. Just like to thank Tim for all the work that he's done and say I'm sorry if he has had any mental breakdown from serving for this long. But Tim, if you're listening, thanks for all you did.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thanks, Eric. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item R, adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Thompson?
Motion we adjourn.
May I have a second? Mr. Leonardo?
Yes, please.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DeNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yep.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye, we are adjourned.